In the last lecture, we talked about loading data into our program from a text file. Taking a look at the text file, we can see that the way that the data is structured is we had, and this is from our candy class defined in candy.vb, we have the candy name, the flavor, and then a quantity. And that format is consistent along all the entries in this file. And the way that we've set this up is that each line represents a separate object, a separate instance of that candy class. What we did now, and we did this on our form load, we created a load candy sub, and what we did is we opened that candydata.txt file into a stream reader. We put it in a while loop, and inside the while loop we did reader.peak is greater than -1. Peak, if you recall, will return a number greater than -1 if there's more lines left in the file. If it's greater than -1, that means there's more data to be read. We read in a line at a time using reader.readLine. We split that line on comma because we defined our data to be a comma delimited file or a comma separated file. And then we created a new instance of our candy class. And you can see what we did here is we went after each of those attributes. And so what we did is name was the first element, flavor the second, and then last was quantity. And you can see that I'm passing the quantity into the constructor here. And let's take a look at that. I'm going to right click on there, go to definition. This takes me into my candy class. And we had set a default constructor where no arguments were passed in and quantity equaled 1. But then also we decided we wanted to be able to set that initial quantity of the new class. And so in this case what we're doing is we're only passing in the quantity. We could have passed in name and flavor. We could overload this again, but really what we wanted in this case is to be able to set that quantity. And if you recall, there's no other way to set that. We declared an add one and eat one, but that's not really the same thing as setting the value. That lets us either increment or decrement by 1. But the only way to really set that initial quantity was through our overloaded constructor here. So after that has been created, we added that candy instance to our collection here. Here is the instance. And then we decided that we also wanted to set a key for that, which makes it easier to go in and retrieve that instance out of our collection. After that, we updated our list box so that we could see the items that have been loaded into. And sure enough, here we go. We can go in and see all of those. But this still doesn't allow us to persist our data. We're loading data that already exists, but if I wanted to go in and say Butterfinger, and say it's a regular, and add that candy in, once I close the application down, we can see from our text file that that wasn't added in there. And if I load it up again, it's not there. So we're really missing half of what we want to do. Being able to load that data in is great, but we really want to be able to persist that data after we close our application down. And so what I want to do now is I'm going to add a button that's going to let me save. I'm copying my button so that I can keep the size and the font. And now I'll go into my properties here. And I'm going to call this button save and change the text to save as well. Alright, and to add that code in, now what we want to do is we're going to do something very similar to what we did for our file IO assignment. Really, all we're doing is writing to a file, and we already know how to do that. But The trick of this is we want to make sure that we keep with this format. Now we typed this in by hand here, but now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looping through what's inside of our list box and inside of our collection object, and now we have to build this programmatically. So we have to make sure that we start with the name, then the flavor and quantity, do a new line, name, flavor, quantity, all separated out by commas. And when you're doing this kind of thing, we could do a string, for example, like this. And then we could go through and we could do something like data equals data ampersand, and then something like candy name. And we could go through there, and this could be inside of a for loop. But this is not the best way to do it. Remember, each string is really an array of characters. And every time you add characters to that, you have to resize the array. And all this stuff is done by the .NET framework underneath the hood, but that doesn't mean that it's not expensive from a processing standpoint. So doing 10 or 20 is not a big deal, but if you had a list of hundreds or thousands, it does start to bog everything down. .NET has a different object, and we're going to call it SBCandy, and it is a string builder. And you'll notice I'm not getting my autocomplete on that, and that's because this is actually part of a different library that we have to bring in. So up to the top next to our already import system.io, I'm going to import system.text. And that gives us a whole lot of different string tools, but the one we're interested in is string builder. And because it is an object class, we need to instantiate it. Okay, now there's three things on here that we're going to be the most interested in that are part of the SBCandy class. One is append, where you give it a string and it will tag that on to the end. And this is really the same thing as doing this. Plus equals, right? Or in our case, ampersand equals, right? That just tags it on to the very end. We can also do append line. This will do the same thing, except it will add a carriage return or new line character to the end of that. So more often than not, you will do this. And I misspoke. I said there were three things on here, but there's actually four. The next one is, how do you get the value back out? Because string builder is not the same thing as a string. It's almost like a collection object in that if you want to get the string out, you have to tell it to come out. And so if we ever do anything like this, if we ever want to go we have to use the string builder .toString object on that. And so the mysterious fourth one on here is going to be SBCandy.append format. And this works very similar to string.format, which we may have talked about or you may have heard about in VB intro as well. But what append format will do is it takes something called a format string, right? And so what the format string will do is, if you don't do anything past maybe what I have here, it's going to give you the exact string that you're looking at. But in that case, then you would just do append or append line. Really where the power comes from is inserting into this format string placeholders. And what the placeholders will do is they give us a way of being able to build text without having all of the things like plus equals or ampersand or having all of that stuff. It lets us stick with a specific format. And in our case, this is great because that's what we want here. We want name, flavor, quantity. And so really, if we're talking about 3 pieces of data, then what I need are 3 placeholders. But if we did just this, it would cram all of my data together and it would have them with no spaces, no commas, or anything else. So this is how we use our format string. If this is the data right here, well, after my first element, which is my name, I'm going to put a comma. And so now it's going to say, well, here's your first piece of data, here's your second, now those are going to be separated by a comma. Same thing with the second and third. I'm going to want a comma as well. So this is half of what doing a string format will give us. The second half of it is, well, we've defined that we want 3 pieces of data here, but now we have to say what data. And so after that, we would have, and let me define this here so that we can have something to work with. And this is just for the sake of the example. We would have something like temp candy dot name, temp candy dot flavor, temp candy dot quantity. And so it goes in an ordinal position. So if this is the first placeholder, and it's not determined by position, it's determined by the number. So 0 is going to be first. So we're going to have 0, and that's going to match up with this one. Then we're going to have 1, and it's 0 based, right, just like an array. So that's going to go for here because that's the second element. And then this should actually be a 2 instead. And so 2, or third, is going to go here. These have to match up. If I had a 0 and a 1, but I only listed one element after this, you would get an error when you try and run it. And there's really no limit within reason about how far this can go. But when you are running this at runtime, it's going to match up 0, 1, 2 with 0, 1, 2 as well. Now, we can be tricky because remember the other part of this is that there should be a new line at the end here too. So there's 2 different ways we can approach this. We could say SB candy, string builder candy dot append line, and then do string dot empty would be one approach. It will append on an empty string, but it will also bring down a carriage return. Or trying to remember some stuff from VB intro, I could add another placeholder on here, and then at the last do control cars dot new line as well. They're really going to be the same either way. Okay, so that is append, append line, and append format. I'm going to clean this up and get rid of these 2 lines here and this as well. And so now what we have to do is we have how we're going to do the format here, but we're not actually doing anything yet. We actually want to create a for loop, and we want to loop through our collection so that we can go ahead and we can actually build this string out, and then we can write it to our file. So I'm going to have my for loop. Remember, collections start at 1. And we don't do count minus 1, we do count because it does start at 1. And there's my loop there. I'm going to move this code into my for loop. And instead of doing new candy here, because remember this was my dummy example, I'm going to say R candy I. And this will loop through each element and create that string for us. And so I'm going to create another variable to hold the whole contents of that string builder so that we can actually look and see what's going to happen. And we're going to call this file contents because this is what we want to write. ToString equals, as string equals sbcandy.toString. I'm going to put a breakpoint here so we can see what's happening. And hit save. And let's take a look. And it's not going to show the new line character because this is all inline stuff, but it does look like that's really what we would be after. It does look like almost exactly like this. Alright, so now that we have the string and we're confident that it represents what we want it to do, now we actually have to write it out to our file contents. So before, whereas we did a stream reader, now we're going to do a stream writer. And we're pulling this from our assignment where we did file IO, create text file, and what we had up here to make sure we're doing the same file is candydata.txt. So let's copy that, bring that down here so that we have the same path. Now, if you recall, same thing as with opening a file to read, I want to do the same thing for write, in that before I do anything else, I want to remember that I'm going to close that file out. So you should always try and code these in pairs so that you don't forget. Okay, now writer.writeLine. This is we say writeLine because we already have the string formatted with our own new line characters. And now write out file contents. So this should be everything that we need to actually write that back out. So let's see what happens when we run it. And let's make this simple. Add candy. So now we have 6 of that one. Let's save it. Oh, and we got an error. It says the process cannot access the file because it is being used by another process. And I think the process that is actually using it right now is us, because we have this open in Visual Studio. So I'm going to close that down and we're going to try again. And let's save it, and another error. It says it's being used by another process again. So let's take a look and see, maybe we didn't close this down properly when we did our initial load. So let's take a look here. Reader as stream reader file.openText while loop, and look, we did not close that file out right here, and that's why we're getting that error. So I guess we should listen to our own advice, and we're going to say reader.close, and that should take care of that problem. So if you get that error message, at least now you would know where it's coming from. Save, and it looks like everything's okay. That's our own breakpoint. F5, and we're going to close this down and load it again to see what happened. And look, I think that's our code that we put in, and it doesn't look like it's saved right, so we're going to have to see what's going on with that. And so this looks correct to me, so we're going to probably want to troubleshoot a little bit and find out what's going on. So now on our form load, let's put a breakpoint here and run and see what's happening. The first line is being read in. So everything looks correct. Our candy is continuing to be added to. And it looks like what happened was there's an error in here somewhere. An exception is being thrown. And if you recall, for whatever reason, VB.NET does not catch exceptions or allow them to be thrown on the form load. So if we really want to see what's going on, and we're sort of used to being brought into Visual Studio every time something like that does happen, But let's put a try catch block around there and then put a breakpoint, and maybe we can see what's going on here. And that took us to it right away. And we have index was outside the bounds of the array. And so maybe we're going to want to go a little closer. And I think what happened was it may have been reading that last line in our file, which accounted as an empty character. So what we should do here is, before we access any of these attributes here, we know that we are going to have 3 attributes per line. So what we can check is, we'll check to see if temp attributes dot length is greater than or equal to 3. And if it is, then go ahead and do this code. If not, then we're going to skip on to the next one. We'll see if that will take care of our exception. And that's what it was. Is I think what happened was, when we did our final write, we did write line. And remember, when we were generating the file, we created a new line character at the end of every line. So what that did is, the last line we wrote had a new line character, and then when we did write line, that had a new line character as well. So it created that. When we were reading the file back in, it thought that the last line was another instance of our candy object, so it got a little mixed up. And so